If you stick with this list, I've got something that I had certainly not seen before, which I'll share with you right at the end. You can, of course, just skip to the end. Hello, I'm Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and today I'm looking at the Gutenberg again, Project Gutenberg. Following on from an earlier video about horror, I'm now looking at 50 fantasy works that you can get for free from Project Gutenberg. Now, fantasy, as we understand the genre now, is a much more difficult genre to try and come up with 50 things. Most of the world famous fantasy stories have all been written within the last 95 years and are still in copyright, but their precursors aren't, and there are other ways to stretch the definition, so you may have to bear with me as I occasionally veer into mythology. The only thing I have tried to do is make sure that I'm not treading on any religious sensibilities and portraying anyone's deities as fantastical. So there is a little bit of mythology involved here, but I think we can safely put some of these into the fantastical realm. In terms of very ancient fantasy, Homer, Iliad, Odyssey. I think these would probably be a given. The same for Gilgamesh. The Volsunga Saga, which I think a few people are reading at the moment. That's available on Gutenberg. If you fancy tackling some Old English, you've got Beowulf there. If you want to go Germanic, where Wagner gets all these ideas from, the Nibelungenlied. So apologies for the pronunciation. And further apologies for my pronunciation of the Mabinogion, a version of which is on Gutenberg written by Lady Charlotte Schreiber. But if all this is sounding a little bit grey and medieval and staid and grim medieval European, then let's go to the Middle East and the Far East. You have the Thousand Nights and One Night. There is Khaled by F. Marion Crawford. Vathek by William Beckford is a spooky old Gothic fantasy. The Kailung stories of Ernest Brammer are available, as are Horace Walpole's Hieroglyphic Tales. We have two great stories of English heroes here on Gutenberg. You have Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, and you have The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. On a journey from travelogue to travelogue satire to satire, we have three you can choose here. The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, and Gargantua and Pantagruel by Rabelais. Coming to the 19th and early 20th centuries, there are a number of British authors whose works, fantastical works, you can get hold of. Now I've actually got some props now to show you. So you have William Morris, not only with The Well at World's End, but a number of other works as well. You have George MacDonald, his fantasies, Lilith, they're on Gutenberg. A number of his other works are on Gutenberg. Lord Dunsany is well represented on Gutenberg. 51 Tales, Gods of Pegana, At the Edge of the World. The Princess Nobody by Andrew Lang is available. A number of works by H. Rider Haggard are available. More fantasy adventure, or the adventure side of fantasy with Haggard, but that fantastical element is still there. The World's Desire by Lang and Haggard might be there as well. C.J. Cutcliffe Hines' A Lost Continent is also on Gutenberg. E. Nesbit also has a number of works on Gutenberg, although some of these are perhaps more aimed at children. There is the Phoenix and the Carpet, and there is a story about dragons, the name of which escapes me, but I will make sure I write down there. And if we're talking children's fantasy, surely the most famous example of that in Britain would be Lewis Carroll. So Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are also on there. Running Lewis Carroll a close second, I would say, for children's fantasy, you have J.M. Barrie. Blood in the Mist by Hope Mirrlees is on Gutenberg. This is a story of the meeting of a fantasy and the real world. The works of Eden Philpotts might be worth looking for, mining for their fantasy components. The Twilight of the Gods and Other Tales by Richard Garnett, a librarian turned writer, someone who I believe was working at the British Library. The earliest of E.R. Edison's novels is on Gutenberg, which is The Worm Ouroboros, a curious mix of fantasy and science fiction. A Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay is also on Gutenberg. But let's not be so parochial and just look at British writers. Zadig by Voltaire is available on Gutenberg. Again, a very satirical bent, but with anything you're going to find a satire in Voltaire. Many of the works of Anatole France are A, available on Gutenberg, and B, have fantastical elements. Someone definitely not known for their fantasy, but who dipped a toe in, is Honoré de Balzac. His novel The Magic Skin is available. And someone who is definitely known for sort of fantasy and ghosty type stories is E.T.A. Hoffman. But don't worry, America, you are also well represented. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain, I would suggest, is a fantasy novel. Possibly also a very, time travel novel. Many of the works of James Branch Cabell are on Gutenberg. For example, The Cream of the Jest. A portal fantasy of a parallel world is on Gutenberg, and that is Fletcher Pratt's The Blue Star. Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, is on Gutenberg. There's too many to talk of here. There are certainly fantasy elements in Tarzan, and also in the Barsoom novels and Pellucidar, and many of his other works. John Uri Lloyd's Etidorphia is on Gutenberg, famous when it was published, and a number of people ended up calling their daughters Etidorphia. But John Uri Lloyd, I would confidently say, is not well remembered now, unlike L. Frank Baum. And if The Wizard of Oz isn't fantasy, I'm not entirely sure what is. There are plenty of Oz novels on Gutenberg, not only by L. Frank Baum, but also the continuation of the story by Ruth Plumley Thompson. On the spookier side, you have The Nightmare Tales of H.P. Blavatsky, the one of the founding or prime movers of the Theosophy movement. You have a number of the novels of Abraham Merritt, A. Merritt, very famous at the time, less famous now, but still fairly well known author. You have, I believe on Gutenberg, both The Moon Pool and The Metal Monster. You also have, for America, one which I have to admit I had not heard of before looking for this list, but I'm absolutely keen on reading, perhaps even more so in this election year, and that is Ingersoll Lockwood's The Baron Trump novels. These were two novels written in 1889 and 1893. The travels and adventures of little Baron Trump and his wonderful dog Bulger. They recount the adventures of the German boy Wilhelm Heinrich Sebastian von Trump, who changes his name to Trump. Baron Trump is precocious, restless, and prone to get into trouble, and often mentions his massive brain and has a personalised insult for most of the people he meets. He also lives in a building named after himself, Castle Trump. I'm not entirely sure why Ingersoll Lockwood's Baron Trump novels became famous again after 2016, but maybe people could help me out in the comments. Oddly enough, Ingersoll Lockwood also went on to write another book called 1900, or The Last President, in which New York City is riven by protests following the shocking victory of a populist candidate in the 1896 presidential election, and brings the downfall of the American Republic. This wouldn't really be a list from me if I didn't shoehorn in some pulp writers. Unfortunately, fantasy is fairly well represented. Franklin Gregory, Karen Anderson, who I think is Paul Anderson's wife, wrote a story called The Piebald Hippogriff, which is on Gutenberg. Chris Neville, Fritz Leiber, H.P. Lovecraft, obviously more on the horror side of things, but certainly an argument to be made for the fantastical side of his writings, to classify certain works as fantasy rather than horror. And a little guy you may have heard of occasionally on this channel and others, called Robert E. Howard, who wrote some Conan or something. I did promise something at the beginning of this video, and it's something I had not seen before. Here is a picture of H.P. Lovecraft smiling. So I had to dig a little bit deeper to find 50 fantasy tales and authors. I do think that is possibly the issue with a genre which is so dominated and has its foundational text as something which has been written in the last 100 years, which is Lord of the Rings. But Lord of the Rings didn't usher in the fantasy world as we know it by itself, and although it's far and away the biggest influence since its publication, I think you'll agree that that list shows the breadth of fantasy worlds and what is considered fantasy outside of dwarves and elves. But it's soon going to be time for me to plumb the depths of Gutenberg once again, as we have upcoming some reading events about westerns, science fiction, Victorian authors, sports. Will I be able to find 50 examples for each of these subjects? Until then, bye.